I'm Aubrey Sitterson, and this is SKALD. You're listening to the only story that matters. One story written by one guy and recorded in one single, flawless take. SKALD is ongoing and serialized. But there's nothing wrong with starting with this very episode. Once you're hooked, you can check out the backstory with previous podcast episodes or the prose volumes, available exclusively on Amazon. This isn't me reading you a story. This is me telling you a story. This is SKALD, part 74. Ho found himself sapped of energy. He shivered involuntarily as every ounce of vigor abandoned him, as his passion, as his hunger, his drive seeped out onto the floor, leaving his legs weak and trembling. Though the crystal veins of that squalid cavern still glowed, still pulsed with eldritch energy, they ceased to bestow their power upon him. They abandoned him. They left him gaping, exhausted, empty, filled with nothing but creeping horror, with revulsion, and with a persistent disgust and shame that dug its claws into the pit of his stomach, refusing to move, cloaking itself in a sickening nausea that made Ho's face turn as green as his glowing eyes, the ones that looked down upon his handiwork, upon the mangled, deformed, perverted, and broken body of a man he once called colleague, once called peer, and at one time even friend. His hate, his rage, his anger. They had left him, and with them they had taken the ecstasy. His drunkenness had left him well before, had left after his body and its preternatural tolerance, after it had worked through the wine he had quaffed. But now, too, the other ecstasy, the self-made ecstasy, the ascension that he himself had caused, it abandoned him, leaving only a roiling disgust, self-made through the abuse of spirits and the abuse of the spirit that Ho himself had summoned into existence. He put his hand to his forehead, drenched in a cold sweat, and he staggered aimlessly. He needed to rest, to sit, to recover, to do something, to do anything, but everywhere he looked in that cavern, he was confronted by horror, by the wreckage of a man that lay before him, a body broken and twisted long before he put it out of its misery. Confronted by the nameless offal and filth that seemed to spread along the floor of its own accord, and confronted by the sickening yellow light that spewed a jaundiced aura out over all but the most darkened corners of the cavern. And out of one of those corners, there spoke a voice that sounded weak and thin, but that was nonetheless filled with an immeasurable sense of what sounded to Ho incongruously like pride. I knew you could do it. Ho swung his head to the side, suddenly, throwing himself off balance ever so briefly. And as he righted himself, as he allowed his swaying motions to ease out like the rocking of a ship, he saw, emerging from the darkness, the waif. He could see no point of ingress. He could see no doorway, no tunnel, no entrance of any kind. Even the hole he had emerged from had disappeared, covered back up with the filth and debris that comprised this hidden enclave. The waif had appeared out of the darkness itself, out of the filth that stayed hidden, out of that which had been cast away. Or perhaps the child had just sat there, silently, unnoticed, watching, biding its time. All along. Where did you come from? Ho spoke haltingly, surprised that after all his transformations, after his rise and his fall, after his evolution and devolution, that his voice still remained unchanged. How is it that I didn't notice you? The waif grinned, flashing a set of decayed and decaying teeth, surrounded by inflamed gums, tinted an angry red. Because no one does. No one ever does. The waif turned its back upon Ho, a sign of disregard, disrespect, of trust, or perhaps a mixture of all three. The child searched the floor of the cavern idly, not bothering to even look back as it spoke. A gift. Ho began to follow the waif, hoping that just as the child had transported him to that filthy cavern, that it could also help him escape from it. A gift? From who? The waif turned, suddenly, all signs of mirth gone from its face, now contorted into a stern expression. Who else? Those such as me? We receive no gifts. No one gives us anything. Everything we have is found or taken. But the gifts we do receive, the gifts we are given, come from one man, one miraculous man. The smile returned to the waif's face, though it now contained a healthy dose of something beyond simple glee. I serve the vermin prince, and I am no longer content with scraps. Before Ho could respond, before he could even think of how to respond, the waif dropped to its skinny, scraped knees, rubbed raw and left infected from a lifetime spent crawling up on the ground. The child, undeterred, undisgusted, completely unfeeling, began to dig furiously in the filth that covered the ground. At first, the waif dug like a child, kneeling in foul-smelling muck. But as the hole deepened, as it widened, The waif rose to its feet, digging like a dog, flinging all manner of nameless sludge back between its legs, a torrent of dross that Ho had to quickly sidestep, and even then, one he only narrowly avoided. The waif dug quickly, impossibly quickly, and before Ho could blink, the child was standing on the lip of yet another tunnel, one that drew the cavern's yellow light into its yawning abyss. Is this another of your gifts? The waif, panting slightly from its exertions, smiled once again. Yes. And without another word, the child hopped into the hole, disappearing into the darkness, an overwhelming blackness that swallowed up the waif just as it hungrily devoured the jaundiced light from that quickly dimming cavern. Ho had no desire to fling himself down yet another hole. He had no desire to go deeper into whatever nightmarish system of tunnels he had entered. He had no desire to do anything but return to the tavern, to spend every coin in his pocket in an effort to forget everything he had seen, everything he knew, and everything he had learned. There was no exit from that cavern except the hole that lay before him. The one that, though it may have been a trick of the dying light, seemed to slowly contract even as he watched it. So after a single, remorseful look back, after a final, shame-faced glance at what Hung had become and what he had turned himself into, Ho continued his descent. And just as before, as Ho entered the tunnel, his breath left him, sucked out of his very lungs by a presence that he could not name and wouldn't have wanted to, even if he could. But unlike before, when he had tumbled endlessly through the filth and the darkness, assaulted by smells and sensations that haunted the dreams of all mortal beings, that existed in some primal racial memory shared by all living creatures, Ho's time in that tunnel was exceedingly, shockingly, impossibly short. No sooner had Ho deposited himself into that tunnel, preparing for the worst, preparing for something even more horrible than what he had already confronted. No sooner had he descended into the darkness, and he found himself on solid footing in the light, and not the sickening, corrupting, jaundiced light of the cavern. No, this was a clear, white light. A light that illuminated and elucidated. A light that dispelled shadows rather than creating them. A light that emanated from simple torches placed upon crude sconces that lined the entirety of those stone walls, the ones that appeared roughly hewn from the bedrock far beneath Ravana's bustling streets. Ho stood for a moment, willing his eyes to adjust to this new light, willing his pupils to shrink back from their instant and impenetrable darkness. But the waif had no time to spare, and was already moving down the hallway, the child's bare feet padding softly upon the immaculate stone, devoid of the filth that had filled the previous cavern. Come. The waif spoke impatiently. He awaits you. Ho followed the child down that twisting hallway. A left, a right, a left, another left. He soon lost count and lost track as they passed through intersection after intersection, glancing down countless identical tunnels made of the same roughly hewn stone and lit by the same clear, white, honest light. At every intersection, the waif would halt, stopping for a brief moment, allowing Ho to catch up, glancing down the tunnels that surrounded them. Noticing the child's hesitation, Ho began to pay more attention at the intersections, cocking his head and listening carefully at each of the stone crossroads. But though he heard the patter of feet, though he heard unintelligible whispers, though he heard the unmistakable sound of joyous laughter, he saw no one but the waif who urged him onward, faster and faster. Child. Ho, his curiosity brimming inside of him, finally spoke. What is this place? The waif nodded, an affirmation of a sentiment that Ho did not know and likely could not understand. This is Ravana. This is the true Ravana. The child ran its skinny, dirty fingers along the stone wall. The city's original streets and byways. Ho was confused, bewildered by the subterranean expanse they traversed. I don't understand. A city beneath the city? The waif shot a smile back at Ho. You understand perfectly. This is the true Ravana, and we are its true inhabitants. And he... The child stopped, closed its eyes, and breathed in deeply as a beatific smile spread across its face. He is our rightful ruler. As Ho walked, thoughts and ideas sprang into his mind unbidden. Memories that were not his own emerged upon the horizon, drawing closer and closer until they filled his entire field of vision. First, he saw the city, saw Ravana, saw his city, saw it as it was currently, as it had become, saw it as it was. Her city, Calaria's city, struggling, failing, and dying of 1,000 wounds, some that the lady had inherited and others that she herself had inflicted. He saw the body of that once great city-state floundering. He watched as an arm was amputated, cut off, abandoned to the centaur hordes in an effort to save the rest. But where that cut occurred, at the site of the incision, infection had taken root, an infection caused by the filth that covered the city, by the refuse, by the discarded, and he watched, terrified, as that wound festered and spread. But beyond that horrible vision, beneath that troubling mirage, Ho saw something else, saw something cleaner and purer, something older and better, a view of the past that he had only heard of in passing, a vision of what was and what might have been, a specter that haunted the minds of all those dissatisfied with what they had inherited, a manifestation of that which those before him had squandered and wasted. He saw Ravenous past as it was and as it had been, or perhaps merely as it should have been. Ho gazed out upon that apparition, that reverie, as comforting as it was deceptive. And he smiled. He swooned at the sight of that clean, perfect city, that pure existence, one where hard work was rewarded, where opportunities were abundant, where those who would deny either of those maxims were exiled, sent to take their distasteful ideologies elsewhere, to impose them upon some less unfortunate burg, or, more likely, to be abandoned to nature, to be abused by the beasts of the wild, just as they themselves would attempt to abuse their fellows. There was justice. There was peace. There was hope. And there was joy. And it all existed in that glorious past, in those gleaming streets, the ones unhindered by filth and refuse, uncluttered by that which had been discarded and cast away, because nothing was discarded. No one was cast away, because everyone had a purpose. Everyone filled a purpose. Everyone embraced their purpose, and together they pushed in unison, driving forward their city's juggernaut of progress. But just as quickly as it had come to him, Ho's vision faded, and he was left looking out upon that same familiar sight. A labyrinth of stone tunnels, lit by torch after torch, flickering bravely as they dispelled the darkness that was ever present, threatening to surround them and take them all to depths unknown, to blackness unimagined, to horrors known only in nightmares. Ho shook his head, allowing his shaggy gray hair to fall down into his face, obscuring his vision, hoping that it would block out the distractions that repeatedly assailed him. The city, it used to be better. The waif, continuing on, nodded adamantly. It did. The past was perfect. Though I have only known the present. Ho brushed his hair back from his face. I can only remember but so far back. But even then, Ho smiled wistfully. It was better. Everything was better. Before things were so complicated. He clenched his eyes shut and pinched the bridge of his nose. The city was better. And it can be better. Once again, the waif turned to face Ho. But how? What can be done? Ho opened his eyes. Too much is cast away. Too much is discarded. Too many are tossed aside. The child reached out a skinny, malnourished hand, touching Ho on his elbow. Once clean streets are now covered in filth, refuse, waste, and garbage are our only inheritance. Ho could see the aching, yearning truth in the waif's eyes. He saw not a hint of malice or dishonesty. He saw only a hope as pure and white as the light emitted by that endless series of torches. Confronted by that truth, Ho then spoke his own. I wish that something, that anything would come. The ocean, the wind, hungry flames, even the centaurs themselves. That they would come, and they would wash it all away. Though Ho had meant to comfort the child, meant to empathize and join with its sentiment, the waif was horrified by the words he spoke. The child recoiled suddenly, removing its hand from Ho's elbow and staggering backward. The hope and truth left the child's eyes, which were subsequently filled with nothing but sheer terror, a fear, not of the old drunk or his words, but of something else, of someone else, someone that the waif looked for, frightfully, glancing repeatedly over its shoulders as it spoke in a hushed voice. Bite your tongue, the waif hissed, and pray that the vermin prince did not hear you. Once satisfied that Ho's indiscretion had gone unnoticed, the waif turned and once again began padding down those endless, twisting hallways, the ones that emitted louder voices and more joyous laughter the longer they traversed those roughly hewn passageways. The waif's pace increased, and Ho struggled to keep up with the child that practically ran down those hallways, choosing new paths at random. And speaking in between breaths, he inquired, "The vermin prince, where is he?" Just then, as if summoned forth by Ho's very question, by the speaking of that terrible name, the one used to frighten every well-born child in that heaving, dying city-state, the pair rounded a final corner, and they were confronted by a door made of mighty wood, made stronger by the ugly, unvarnished knots that filled it, then banded with crude iron for further security. The door towered over them, seamlessly filling the hallway. The waif turned to face Ho and gestured back at the portal. Beyond, he waits for you. Ho, carefully, warily, but knowing that he had no other options, approached the door slowly, passing by the waif. "Thank you for your guidance." His thanks was genuine and generous, as he saw no reason to give that child anything but kindness. "I serve the Vermin Prince." The waif's voice receded into breathy whispers, and the waif itself disappeared into the maze of tunnels that they had traveled together. Wishing that he could trade all the coins in his pockets, all the wealth he had and would ever see, wishing that he could give it all for a simple skin of wine, Ho reached out a hand and he placed it upon the door. But just as quickly as he touched it, he recoiled, pulling back a hand racked by the shakes. The wood of the door was unnaturally hot, and the iron impossibly cold, and the burning chills of both sent shivers up and down his spine. The door had no knocker, had no handle, had nothing to indicate how one might open it. But Ho knew, unless he wished to live out the rest of his days in that maze of tunnels, he had no choice but to move forward, to plow ahead, to confront whatever dangers awaited him. So he reached out again to touch the door, this time with the back of his hand. But before he could even make contact, that uncanny door swung open of its own accord. What awaited Ho behind that door was, in a word, overwhelming. It was an assault on his senses, on all of his senses, on senses he couldn't name and didn't even know he had. Because as the door opened, allowing the white light of the hallway in, thick plumes of incense rolled outward, a pink haze of smoke that smelled of rotting fruit, the sickly sweet stench of putrefaction. Ho traced the smoke to its origins, a set of simple iron thuribles hanging from chains in the ceiling. The metal globes didn't just give off smoke, however. They also emitted a nauseating pink light that filled the room, their circles of illumination converging on a single point. A profane altar. Comprised of garbage and refuse, covered in filth, the altar was a mockery of all that which was holy, was a willing affront to purity and those that aspired to it. While countless temples had been erected to the divine, to that which transcended humanity, to that which surpassed the physical world. This was something else. This was a paean to the discarded, a triumphant hymn of filth and refuse. Surrounding that altar were ornate symbols, Arcane runes forced together into illegible words, into nonsensical sentences, but once combined, once scrawled out upon the stone floor in that stinking orger, they comprised a sigil of power, a sigil of strength and refusal of weakness, a rebuttal to all that embodied by Ravena, by its lady, and by her willing servants, her willing slaves, and at the center of that pulsing sigil, that sinister tool of evocation, his brows lowered so deeply that they covered his eyes. There huddled a sneering, naked figure. Oh gasped, then began to cough from the incense that flooded into his lungs. You, but you're... His sneer turning upward in an expression that was less a smile and more a baring of teeth. The figure spoke. I am the Vermin Prince, and I am no longer content with scraps. Thanks for checking out this, the best episode of SKALD yet. I know that what I'm doing on SKALD is quality stuff. I know it. But here's the difficult part. Letting everyone else know about it. I need your help to spread the word. And the best way to do it? By writing a review on iTunes. Leave a good one, and I'll read it on the show. The Foxblood says, the only story that matters. Brutal and satisfying. Each episode has me at the edge of my seat. Start with any of them, but I highly recommend listening to every episode. Do yourself a favor and give this show a try. You will not regret it. As announced on last week's show, I've got some big stuff planned once we hit $250 a month on Patreon. Because once we hit that goal, that totally reasonable, totally achievable goal, I'm going to start playing live synth intros and outros for the show. It's going to be weird, psychedelic, and awesome. Help make it happen. Help pitch in to keep your favorite podcast going by heading over to patreon.com/skald today. Patreon is the absolute best way to help support SKALD. But there are also a bunch of totally free things you can do, too. After you've written your iTunes review, share each episode on social media. Tell your friends and coworkers about it. Hell, write blogs about the only story that matters. And make sure to tag me, because I share and retweet everything. I'm Aubrey Sitterson on all social media platforms. At this year's San Diego Comic-Con, my good pal and SKALD listener, Julio Rodriguez, brought me an amazing gift. An old collection of fabulous furry Freak Brothers comics. I'd read about them in the past, but I'd never actually gotten around to reading them before. And man, let me tell you, I seriously regret that it's taken me this long to come around to them. They are very, very, very non-PC, and they're very much rooted in their time, the late 60s and early 70s. But they are still absolutely hysterical as they follow the eponymous trio of hippies in their never-ending quest to get high and cut loose. You can probably find volumes in used bookstores around town, or just pick up the Omnibus, which collects all of the strips. Thanks for listening. I'll talk at you next week.